The road stretched endlessly ahead of Jack, a ribbon of cracked asphalt winding through desolate fields. Night had fallen hours ago, swallowing the landscape in a suffocating darkness. His 18-wheeler roared steadily beneath him, its headlights slicing through the void. Jack had been on the road for 20 years and thought he'd seen it all. Storms that could knock a rig off its wheels, strange hitchhikers with stories that didn't add up, even the occasional flicker of something unexplainable in his rearview mirror. But nothing prepared him for that night. He was hauling refrigerated goods, the hum of the cooling unit a familiar companion. His CB radio crackled occasionally with bursts of static or the lonely voices of other truckers. Tonight, though, the airwaves were eerily quiet. The only sound was the rhythmic rumble of tires against the pavement and the occasional rustle of wind through the empty plains. Jack's route took him down State Route 491, a stretch of highway infamous among truckers. They called it the Devil's Corridor. Stories of ghostly figures, phantom lights, and trucks disappearing without a trace were common lore. Jack didn't put much stock in the tales. Stories were just a way to kill time at truck stops. But tonight, the darkness felt heavier, pressing against his windshield like a living thing. About 2 hours past midnight, Jack noticed something odd. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, small and faint at first, but growing brighter as they approached. Nothing unusual, except that they were on his side of the road. He honked his horn, a deep blast that echoed into the night, but the lights didn't waver. He flicked his high beams, and the headlights blinked out of existence. Jack blinked in confusion. There was no screech of tires, no shadow of a vehicle veering off into the field, just the oppressive darkness swallowing the road once more. He glanced in his side mirrors, but the highway behind him was empty. Must have been tired, he muttered to himself, shaking his head. But his hands tightened on the wheel, and his pulse thrummed in his ears. An hour later, the hum of the cooling unit changed pitch, a whining screech that grated against his nerves. Jack glanced at the temperature gauge on his dash. The needle was in the red. He swore under his breath and pulled onto the shoulder. The highway was deserted, no sign of life in any direction. Just his luck, breaking down in the middle of nowhere. Grabbing his flashlight, Jack stepped out of the cab. The cold hit him immediately, sharp and biting. The air smelled wrong, metallic, almost like blood. He shook it off and made his way to the back of the truck. His boots crunched on gravel, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. He opened the trailer door, expecting to see malfunctioning equipment or a broken coolant line. Instead, the flashlight beam illuminated something that made his stomach drop. The floor of the trailer was smeared with handprints. Bloody, clawed handprints that streaked toward the walls and ceiling as if someone had been desperately trying to escape. Jack stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from his grip. It clattered to the ground and rolled, casting eerie, shifting shadows across the interior of the trailer. He drew his phone from his pocket, fingers trembling as he tried to dial 911. No signal. A sound froze him in place. A low, guttural growl, followed by the unmistakable scrape of claws on metal. It came from inside the trailer. Jack's breath came in shallow gasps as he stared into the darkness. A pair of glowing eyes appeared, unblinking and malevolent, followed by a flash of teeth too long and sharp to belong to any animal he'd ever seen. Jack didn't wait to find out what it was. He turned and ran, his boots slipping on the gravel as he bolted back to the cab. Slamming the door shut, he locked it and fumbled to start the engine. The truck roared to life, and he floored the gas pedal. The rig lurched forward, tires spitting gravel as he swerved back onto the highway. In the rearview mirror, he saw the trailer doors swing open violently. Something leaped out, landing on all fours before standing upright. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs elongated and bent at impossible angles. It started running after the truck, its movements jerky but horrifyingly fast. Jack's heart pounded as he pushed the rig to its limits. The creature kept pace, its glowing eyes locked on him. He reached for the CB radio, shouting for help, but the static was deafening. No one answered. The thing clawed at the back of the truck, its nails screeching against the metal. Jack swerved, trying to shake it off, but it clung on. He spotted a rest stop up ahead, its lights a beacon in the darkness. Desperation fueled him as he barreled toward it. As he pulled into the lot, the creature dropped away, vanishing into the shadows. Jack slammed on the brakes, his truck skidding to a halt. He jumped out, shouting for help, but the rest stop was eerily empty. The lights flickered, casting long, ominous shadows. Jack spent the rest of the night locked in his cab, his shotgun across his lap. When dawn broke, he inspected the trailer. The bloody handprints were gone, the doors securely shut. The cooling unit was functioning perfectly. Jack quit trucking a week later. To this day, he refuses to talk about what happened on Route 491. The only thing he tells people is to stay off the Devil's Corridor after dark. Some roads, he says, are better left untraveled.
Story number 2.
The rain had started just after dusk, a cold, relentless downpour that turned the highway into a slick ribbon of danger. Mason hated driving in the rain, but he had no choice. He was hauling a load of construction materials to a site 2 states away, and his boss made it clear, no delays. He'd been on the road for hours, the rhythm of the windshield wipers and the low hum of the engine lulling him into a trance-like focus. The road was deserted, the occasional flash of lightning illuminating endless forests pressing in on either side. His only companion was the CB radio, which crackled with static between bursts of chatter from other truckers. At around 1 a.m., a voice came through the radio, cutting through the static. It wasn't the usual gruff tone Mason was used to hearing. This voice was soft, almost pleading. "Breaker, breaker, anyone out there?" Mason hesitated, his hand hovering over the radio. There was something off about the voice, something that made the hair on his neck stand up, but curiosity got the better of him. "This is Big Rig Mason. You okay out there?" A pause. Then the voice came again, trembling. "I'm lost. I think someone's following me. Can you help?" Mason frowned, glancing at his GPS. He was on Route 67, a long stretch of highway known for its isolation. The nearest town was 30 miles away. "Where are you?" he asked. "I don't know," the voice replied. "It's dark. No lights. Just trees." Static filled the radio again, followed by a faint sound Mason couldn't quite place. It was a wet, dragging noise, like something being pulled through mud. "Stay on the line," Mason said, his voice steady despite the unease crawling through him. "Can you describe what's around you?" The voice didn't answer immediately. When it came back, it was a whisper. "It's here." Mason's stomach tightened. "What's there? Talk to me." The radio went silent. Mason's grip on the wheel tightened as he scanned the dark road ahead. The rain was coming down harder now, the wipers struggling to keep up. His headlights caught something on the shoulder up ahead, a figure standing in the rain, waving. He slowed down, his heart pounding. It was a woman, drenched and shivering, her face pale and gaunt. She looked up as his truck approached, her eyes wide with terror. Mason pulled over, rolling down the window just enough to be heard over the storm. "You okay?" he shouted. "They're coming," she said, her voice hoarse. "Please, you have to help me." Before Mason could respond, a noise erupted from the woods behind her, a guttural growl, low and menacing. The woman's eyes widened further, and she screamed, bolting toward the truck. "Get in!" Mason yelled, throwing open the passenger door. She scrambled inside, slamming the door shut just as something burst out of the trees. Mason caught a glimpse of it in his side mirror, a hulking, misshapen figure, its skin mottled and raw, its eyes glowing like embers. Mason floored the gas pedal, the truck lurching forward as the creature lunged at them. Its claws scraped against the trailer, a screeching sound that set Mason's teeth on edge. "What the hell is that?" he shouted, glancing at the woman. She was curled up in the seat, her arms wrapped around herself. "It doesn't stop," she whispered. "It follows. It always follows." Mason's blood ran cold. He checked the mirror again. The creature was chasing them, its distorted limbs propelling it forward at an unnatural speed. The woman looked at him, her eyes hollow. "You shouldn't have stopped." "What?" Mason barked. "You shouldn't have stopped for me," she repeated, her voice flat. "It's your problem now." Before Mason could process her words, the truck's engine sputtered. The dashboard lights flickered, and the vehicle slowed despite his foot pressing the accelerator to the floor. "No, no, no!" Mason shouted, slamming his fist against the wheel. The truck rolled to a stop in the middle of the highway, the rain pounding against the cab. Mason's breath came in shallow gasps as he stared at the woman. She was gone. The seat beside him was empty, water pooling where she'd been sitting. A loud thud shook the truck. Mason turned to see the creature clawing at the driver's side window, its face inches from his. Its eyes burned with a terrifying intelligence, its jagged teeth bared in a grotesque grin. Mason fumbled for the door handle on the passenger side, throwing it open and tumbling into the rain. He ran, the cold mud sucking at his boots, the creature's growls echoing in his ears. He didn't stop until he reached the woods, his legs burning and his lungs aching. He crouched behind a tree, his hands shaking as he tried to catch his breath. The highway was silent now, the truck a shadow in the distance. But Mason knew it wasn't over. Somewhere out there, the creature was still hunting, and it wouldn't stop until it found him.
Story number 3.
The night was unnervingly quiet as Tom cruised down a lonely stretch of Highway 93, his 18-wheeler humming steadily beneath him. The highway was known among truckers as the Widow's Route, not because of its sharp turns or dangerous inclines, but because of the strange things that seemed to happen on its dark stretches. Tom didn't believe in the supernatural, though. He believed in long hours, tight deadlines, and the need to keep his eyes on the road. It was nearly 2 a.m. when he spotted the flashing hazard lights of a car pulled over on the shoulder. A figure stood beside it, waving desperately. Normally, Tom wouldn't stop. Too many stories about truckers getting robbed or worse. But the figure looked like a kid, maybe in his late teens, soaked to the bone in the cold night rain. Tom sighed and slowed his rig, pulling over a few yards ahead. Grabbing his flashlight, he climbed down from the cab and approached cautiously. "You okay?" he called out. The boy turned to face him, shivering violently. His clothes were torn, his face pale and streaked with dirt. "My car broke down," he said, his voice trembling. "Can you give me a ride to the next town?" Tom hesitated. The kid looked harmless enough, but something about the situation set his nerves on edge. Still, he wasn't about to leave a kid stranded in the middle of nowhere. "All right," he said, motioning toward the truck. "Get in." The boy climbed into the passenger seat, huddling into himself for warmth. Tom handed him a spare blanket from behind the seat. "Where are you headed?" Tom asked as he merged back onto the highway. "Anywhere but here," the boy muttered, staring out the window. Tom glanced at him. "You in trouble?" The boy didn't answer. Instead, he pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders, his eyes darting nervously to the side mirror. Tom followed his gaze, but saw nothing but the empty highway stretching behind them. They drove in silence for a while, the only sounds the rumble of the engine and the rain pattering against the windshield. Tom couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. "So, what happened back there?" he asked finally. The boy turned to him, his face pale. I don't know what it was," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something came out of the woods. It was tall, too tall, and its face, it didn't have a face." Tom's hands tightened on the wheel. "You're saying something attacked your car?" The boy nodded. "It tore through the hood like it was made of paper. I thought it was going to catch me." Tom tried to dismiss the boy's story as the ramblings of a scared kid, but his gut told him otherwise. He'd heard stories from other truckers about strange creatures on this highway, things that couldn't be explained. He flicked his eyes to the side mirror again, and this time his heart nearly stopped. A shadow moved on the edge of the headlight's reach, keeping pace with the truck. It was large and impossibly fast, its long limbs skimming the ground in an unnatural gait. "Do you see that?" Tom asked, his voice tight. The boy turned, his eyes widening in terror. "It's here." The shadow suddenly surged forward, slamming into the side of the truck with a force that shook the cab. Tom fought to keep control, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. "What the hell is it?" he shouted. The boy didn't answer. He was staring out the window, his mouth moving soundlessly as tears streamed down his face. The creature struck the truck again, this time near the rear tires. Tom felt the trailer sway dangerously and heard the unmistakable sound of metal tearing. "We have to get out of here," the boy screamed. Tom pressed the gas pedal to the floor, the engine roaring as the truck surged forward. The creature appeared in the rearview mirror, its eyeless face illuminated briefly by the brake lights. It let out a high-pitched screech that made Tom's ears ring, then disappeared into the darkness. Tom didn't slow down until he saw the lights of a rest stop ahead. He pulled into the lot, his heart pounding, and killed the engine. The boy was trembling violently, his eyes darting around as if expecting the creature to appear at any moment. "You're safe now," Tom said, though he didn't quite believe it himself. The boy shook his head. "It doesn't stop. It never stops." Before Tom could respond, the truck shuddered violently. A loud thud reverberated through the cab, and the boy let out a choked sob. Tom grabbed the shotgun he kept behind the seat and stepped out, his heart hammering in his chest. The rain had stopped, but the air felt heavy, charged with something unnatural. He circled the truck, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The trailer was torn open, the cargo scattered across the lot. Deep claw marks scored the metal, and a foul, acrid smell hung in the air. Then he heard it. A a low, guttural growl that sent chills racing down his spine. He turned slowly, the flashlight trembling in his grip. The creature stood at the edge of the lot, its elongated limbs twitching unnaturally, its eyeless face locked onto him. It let out another ear-piercing screech and charged. Tom raised the shotgun and fired, the blast echoing across the empty lot. The creature staggered but didn't stop. Tom fired again and again until the gun clicked empty. The creature hesitated, its movements jerky, before retreating into the shadows. Tom didn't wait to see if it would come back. He climbed into the cab, slammed the door, and floored it out of the lot. The boy was gone. The blanket he'd been wrapped in lay crumpled on the seat, damp with rain. To this day, Tom doesn't know what he encountered on Highway 93. All he knows is that he never drives that route anymore, and he never, ever picks up hitchhikers.
Story number 4.
The clock on the dashboard glowed 12:17 a.m. as Eddie adjusted his grip on the wheel, the leather cool and familiar under his hands. The desert highway stretched ahead of him like a black ribbon, empty, except for the occasional tumbleweeds scuttling across the road. The route was desolate, infamous among truckers for its eerie silence. Locals called it Dead Man's Pass, but Eddie wasn't the superstitious type. It was just another late-night haul, or so he thought. The first sign of trouble came when his radio crackled to life. Static filled the cab, loud and sharp, even though Eddie hadn't touched the dial in hours. He reached out to adjust it, but before his hand could make contact, a voice broke through the noise. "Help, please." The words were faint, barely audible over the static. Eddie froze, his pulse quickening. "Who's out there?" he asked, leaning toward the radio. No response. The static persisted, rising and falling in waves. Eddie glanced at the GPS. The map showed nothing but empty desert for miles. He frowned, turning the volume down and focusing on the road. That's when he saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the highway, illuminated by his high beams. "Jesus Christ!" Eddie muttered, slamming on the brakes. The truck screeched to a halt, the tires skidding on the asphalt. The figure didn't move. It was a woman, barefoot and wearing a torn white dress. Her hair hung in wet, tangled strands over her face. Eddie's heart pounded as he leaned out the window. "You okay?" he called. The woman didn't answer. She just stood there, her head tilted slightly as if listening to something Eddie couldn't hear. "Hey, lady, you need help or what?" Slowly, she turned her head toward him. Her face was pale, almost translucent in the glow of the headlights. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, were pitch black. Eddie felt a jolt of fear as her lips parted into a smile that was too wide, stretching unnaturally across her face. Eddie's survival instincts kicked in. He yanked the truck into gear and floored the gas, swerving around the woman. As he passed her, she didn't flinch, didn't even turn her head to follow him. But in the mirror, Eddie saw her standing in the middle of the road, her head tilted again, watching him drive away. He pushed the truck hard, the engine roaring as he sped down the empty highway. His heart was pounding, and his hands were slick on the wheel. A few miles later, his headlights caught movement on the side of the road. Eddie's stomach turned. It was the woman again, standing just outside the reach of his lights, her head tilted in that same eerie way. "Impossible," he muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. He pressed the accelerator harder, refusing to look in the mirrors. The radio crackled again. "Help me." This time, the voice was louder, clearer. It sounded like a child, terrified and sobbing. Eddie shook his head, his breathing ragged. Nope, not happening, not real. The radio went silent for a moment, and then the sobbing turned into laughter. It was high-pitched and hollow, echoing through the cab. Eddie yanked the radio's power knob, but the laughter continued. Louder and louder. Then he felt it, a cold breath on the back of his neck. Eddie swerved violently, the truck lurching as he fought to stay on the road. He glanced in the rearview mirror, his blood turning to ice. She was sitting in the sleeper cab. The woman's black eyes bore into him as her too-wide smile stretched impossibly further, exposing rows of jagged teeth. Eddie screamed, slamming his fist against the dashboard. "Get out! Get the hell out!" The woman didn't move. She just sat there, her head tilting slowly to one side. Eddie's vision blurred with panic as he spotted the faint glow of a rest stop up ahead. He didn't slow down, didn't care about the damage he might cause. He barreled into the lot, slamming the brakes and skidding to a stop in front of a diner. He threw the door open and stumbled out, falling to his knees in the gravel. The cold night air stung his skin, and his chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath. The truck was silent, its headlights casting long shadows across the lot. Slowly, Eddie stood and peered into the cab. It was empty. The woman was gone. Eddie's legs felt like jelly as he stumbled into the diner. The place was nearly empty, save for a tired-looking waitress behind the counter and a trucker nursing a cup of coffee at a corner booth. The waitress looked up, her brow furrowing. "You okay, hon? You look like you've seen a ghost." Eddie collapsed onto a stool, his hands trembling. "I think I did." The trucker in the booth snorted. "Let me guess. Deadman's Pass?" Eddie nodded, his throat too dry to speak. The waitress exchanged a knowing glance with the trucker. "You're not the first," she said, pouring him a cup of coffee, "and you won't be the last." Eddie never finished that route. He left the truck at the diner and caught a bus home the next morning. To this day, he refuses to drive at night, and he'll tell anyone who will listen, if you're ever on Dead Man's Pass and see a woman in white, don't stop, don't even look.
Story number 5.
The truck stop was eerily quiet when Jack pulled in, his rig rumbling to a halt. He'd been driving for hours along a lonely highway that cut through miles of empty plains, his eyes burning from staring at the monotonous road. He needed coffee, maybe a quick bite, and a few minutes to stretch his legs before pushing through to his delivery destination. The place was run down, its neon open 24 hours sign flickering like it was on its last breath. A single pickup truck was parked at the far end of the lot, and inside the diner, only a lone waitress moved sluggishly behind the counter. Jack grabbed his thermos and stepped out into the cold night air. The silence was oppressive, the kind that made your ears strain for any sound. He pushed open the door to the diner, and the bell overhead jingled weakly. "Coffee?" the waitress asked without looking up. Jack nodded, sliding into a booth near the window. He glanced outside, his rig sitting alone under a single dim light. The waitress brought his coffee and lingered for a moment, her tired eyes scanning his face. "You headed north?" she asked, her voice low. "Yeah," Jack replied, stirring sugar into his cup. "Why?" She hesitated, biting her lip. "You sure that's a good idea?" Jack frowned. "Why wouldn't it be?" The waitress leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper. "We don't get many drivers this late. Those who do, well, they don't always make it." Jack chuckled nervously. "Sounds like a campfire story." Her expression didn't change. "It's not." Before Jack could press her further, the door to the diner creaked open. A man stepped in, his face obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. His boots echoed on the linoleum floor as he walked to the counter and sat without a word. The waitress stiffened. "Excuse me," she muttered, hurrying back to the kitchen. Jack watched the man for a moment. Something about him felt off. His clothes were outdated, like he'd stepped out of a different century, and his hands, resting on the counter, were unnaturally pale. Jack tried to shake off the unease, turning back to his coffee. He was just tired, he told himself. Long hours on the road could make anyone paranoid. But then he noticed something strange. In the reflection of the window, the man at the counter wasn't there. Jack blinked, his pulse quickening. He turned to look directly at the man who was now staring at him, his head tilted slightly. A slow, unnatural smile spread across the man's face, his teeth too white, too perfect. Jack shot to his feet, the coffee forgotten. The waitress reappeared, her face pale as she gestured for him to leave. "Go," she whispered urgently. "Get in your truck and drive. Don't stop. Don't look back." Jack didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed his jacket and bolted for the door. As he climbed into his rig and started the engine, he saw the man standing in the doorway of the diner, watching him with that unnerving smile. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but the shadows seemed darker, deeper. Jack hit the gas, the truck roaring as he sped down the highway. It wasn't until he was a few miles out that he realized the radio was on, though he hadn't touched it. Static filled the cab, followed by a faint, distorted voice. "Why are you running, Jack?" Jack's blood ran cold. He grabbed the knob, twisting it, but the voice continued, rising in pitch. "You can't escape." The truck's headlights flickered, and for a split second, Jack thought he saw something in the road ahead. A figure, the man from the diner. He swerved, narrowly avoiding the ditch, and when he looked back, the road was empty. His hands shook as he gripped the wheel, his eyes darting to the mirrors. That's when he saw the man again, sitting in the passenger seat. Jack slammed the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt. He turned, his breath catching in his throat. The seat was empty. Heart pounding, he floored the gas and didn't let up until the sun began to rise, burning away the shadows. When Jack finally reached the next truck stop, he pulled in, shaking and exhausted. He stumbled into the diner, mumbling about needing coffee and answers. The waitress behind the counter frowned. "You look like hell," she said. "What happened?" Jack told her everything. The diner, the man, the voice on the radio. Her face turned ashen. "That place hasn't been open in years," she said. "Burned down after a driver swerved to avoid someone in the road and crashed into the gas pumps. People say he still haunts the highway looking for company." Jack didn't respond. He didn't stay for coffee. He never drove that route again.
Story number 6.
The night was dark as ink as Maria guided her rig through a narrow, winding mountain pass. The air outside was biting cold, her headlights barely cutting through the dense fog that had crept in over the past hour. She hated this route, always had, but the extra money for nighttime hauls was hard to pass up. The radio sputtered, and she fiddled with the dial, trying to find something to fill the silence. Static greeted her every attempt, so she finally gave up, letting the hum of the engine and the occasional groan of the road beneath the tires keep her company. As Maria rounded a sharp bend, she spotted it. A battered pickup truck parked on the shoulder, its hazard lights weakly flashing. Standing next to it was a man, waving his arms frantically. "Damn it," Maria muttered under her breath. She wasn't one to leave someone stranded, especially not in a place like this. She slowed her rig and pulled over, leaving the engine idling. Grabbing her flashlight, she climbed out of the cab, her boots crunching on the gravel shoulder. "You all right?" she called out, shining the beam toward the man. He looked ordinary enough, mid-40s, wearing a heavy jacket and jeans. His face was pale, though, and his eyes darted nervously between Maria and the dark woods behind him. "Thank God you stopped," he said, his voice trembling. "My truck died, and there's something out there." Maria frowned. "Something? Like a bear?" The man shook his head violently. "No, it's bigger, and it's watching me. I saw it move between the trees." Maria scanned the forest with her flashlight, but the beam was swallowed almost immediately by the dense fog. She didn't see anything unusual, but her gut told her to trust the man's fear. "Hop in," she said. "I'll take you to the next town." The man didn't hesitate, climbing into the cab as Maria slid back into the driver's seat. She glanced at him as she pulled onto the road. "What exactly did you see?" He opened his mouth to answer, but a loud thud reverberated through the truck, cutting him off. Maria's heart jumped as the rig swayed slightly, like something heavy had climbed onto the trailer. "What the hell was that?" she said, gripping the wheel tightly. The man's face went ashen. "It's here," he whispered. Maria tried to stay calm, her eyes darting between the road and the side mirrors. In the dim light, she caught a glimpse of movement, something large and impossibly fast darting along the side of the truck. Another thud, this time closer. The man whimpered, curling into himself as if trying to disappear. "Stay here," Maria said, her voice steadier than she felt. She grabbed the tire iron from behind her seat and climbed out of the cab, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The fog seemed thicker now, wrapping around her like a living thing. She walked toward the rear of the truck, every nerve in her body screaming at her to get back inside. She froze when she saw it. Perched on top of the trailer was a figure, humanoid but grotesquely distorted. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle as if studying her. Its skin was pale and glistened in the fog, and its eyes, large black voids, seemed to drink in the light of her flashlight. Maria's breath caught in her throat. The creature moved, its body unfolding like a spider as it crawled down the side of the trailer with sickening grace. She stumbled back, her hand tightening on the tire iron. "Get away!" she shouted, her voice cracking. The creature paused, tilting its head again before letting out a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through her chest. Maria bolted. She scrambled back into the cab, slamming the door and locking it. "Go! Go!" the man screamed, his voice high with panic. Maria didn't need to be told twice. She floored the gas, the truck lurching forward as the creature leapt from the trailer and disappeared into the fog. For a moment, Maria thought they were safe, but then the roof of the cab buckled with a deafening crash, and she screamed. The man was sobbing now, repeating, "It's here, over and over. Maria's hands were slick with sweat as she fought to keep the truck on the road. She felt another impact, this time on the windshield, and the creature's face appeared, its mouth a gaping maw filled with needle-like teeth. She swerved wildly, trying to shake it off, and the truck skidded dangerously close to the edge of the pass. "Hold on," she shouted, jerking the wheel hard to the left. The sudden motion sent the creature flying off the hood, and Maria didn't slow down to see where it landed. They didn't stop until they reached the lights of a small truck stop miles down the road. Maria parked haphazardly, her hands still trembling as she climbed out. The man bolted out of the cab, muttering something about never taking this route again. Maria stared back down the highway, half expecting to see the creature emerging from the fog. But the road was empty, silent, except for the distant hum of her truck's engine. She decided then and there that this was her last haul through the mountains. The next morning, Maria learned something chilling from the diner staff at the truck stop. The mountain pass had been the site of numerous unexplained disappearances over the years. Local legends spoke of a watcher in the fog, a creature that hunted travelers who dared cross its path. Maria didn't wait to hear the rest. She left her coffee untouched and drove straight home, vowing never to return to that cursed road.
Story number 7.
The desert highway was empty, a straight line cutting through the endless sands under a pale moon. Tom had been on the road for hours, his rig the only thing moving for miles. The isolation didn't bother him. It was part of the job. But tonight, something felt different. He first noticed it when his headlights flickered, just for a second. He frowned, tapping the dashboard. "Not now," he muttered. The truck had been running fine earlier, and the last thing he needed was electrical problems in the middle of nowhere. A few miles down the road, the CB radio crackled to life. "Breaker, breaker. Anybody out there?" Tom picked up the receiver. "Yeah, this is Big Dog. Who's calling?" Silence. "Come again?" he said, feeling a prick of unease. The radio hissed, and then came a voice, a woman's, faint and trembling. "Help me, please." Tom's grip on the receiver tightened. "What's wrong? Where are you?" I'm on the road. It's coming." "What's coming?" The line went dead, replaced by static. Tom glanced out the window, scanning the darkness. Nothing but desert and the faint shimmer of heat waves under the moonlight. He shook his head, setting the receiver down. Probably a prank, he thought. Weirdos love messing with truckers. But then he saw it, a figure standing on the shoulder of the road, illuminated in his high beams. It was a woman, barefoot and wearing a torn dress that fluttered in the dry wind. She didn't wave or move, just stood there, staring at him as he approached. Tom slowed the truck, his heart thudding. He rolled down the window slightly. "You okay, lady?" he called out. She didn't answer. Her head tilted to the side, and for a moment Tom thought he saw something behind her, a shadow darker than the night itself. "Need a ride?" he asked, uneasy. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Tom's instincts screamed at him to keep driving, but he couldn't leave her out here alone. He reached over to unlock the passenger door. Before he could, she vanished. Tom blinked, his breath catching in his throat. He leaned out the window, shining a flashlight onto the road and the desert beyond. There was no sign of her. No footprints, no movement, nothing. He pulled the window up, locking the doors. The truck rumbled forward again, but his eyes kept flicking to the mirrors, half expecting to see her there. A few miles later, the CB crackled again. "Help me," the voice said. This time, it was closer, more desperate. "It's coming. Don't stop." Tom grabbed the receiver. "Lady, where are you? What's coming?" A loud, guttural growl erupted from the speaker, sending a jolt of fear through him. It didn't sound human. Suddenly, the truck shuddered, as if something massive had slammed into the trailer. Tom swerved, fighting to keep the rig on the road. His headlights caught movement in the mirrors, something large running alongside the truck. It was fast, faster than anything he'd ever seen. The creature was vaguely humanoid, but its proportions were wrong. Too tall, its limbs too long. Its face was pale, featureless except for a gaping mouth that split open as it ran, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Tom floored the gas, the engine roaring as the truck surged forward, but the creature kept pace, its clawed hands scraping against the trailer with a screeching sound that made Tom's skin crawl. He grabbed his phone, dialing 911 with one hand while keeping the other on the wheel. 911, what's your emergency?" "There's something chasing me," Tom shouted. "I'm on Highway 50, about 50 miles west of..." The call cut off, replaced by static. Tom looked at his phone. It was dead. The creature leapt onto the roof of the cab, the impact making the whole truck shudder. Tom heard it crawling, its claws digging into the metal. Desperation took over. He spotted a turnoff ahead, leading to what looked like an abandoned gas station. He swerved onto the dirt road, the truck bouncing violently as he braked hard, skidding to a stop in front of the station. Tom grabbed his tire iron and jumped out, his eyes darting to the roof. The creature was gone. The desert was silent except for the ticking of the truck's cooling engine. Tom scanned the area, his flashlight shaking in his hand. That's when he heard it, a low growl coming from the shadows near the gas station. He backed up, gripping the tire iron tightly. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice echoing in the emptiness. The growling grew louder, closer. A pair of glowing eyes appeared in the darkness, followed by another, and another. Tom realized with a sinking dread that there wasn't just one creature. There were several, their pale forms emerging from the shadows like ghosts. He scrambled back into the cab, slamming the door and locking it. The creatures surrounded the truck, their claws scraping against the metal, their mouths opening in silent, hungry screams. Tom hit the gas, the truck lurching forward. The creatures gave chase, but as he sped back onto the highway, they fell behind, disappearing into the night. He didn't stop driving until dawn, when he reached a truck stop crowded with other rigs. Exhausted and shaking, he told the other drivers what he'd seen. They listened in silence, their faces grim. One of them nodded. "You were on the devil's stretch," he said. "Seen a lot of weird things out there, people who don't make it back." Tom never drove that route again. But every now and then, late at night, he hears the faint sound of claws scraping metal and wonders if the creatures are still out there, waiting.
Story number 8.
The storm was relentless, sheets of rain hammering down on the highway as Luke guided his 18-wheeler through the winding backroads of the Appalachian Mountains. His GPS had rerouted him due to a pileup on the main highway, sending him down a poorly lit stretch of road that didn't seem to have seen a maintenance crew in decades. The windshield wipers struggled against the downpour, the view ahead reduced to a blur of black asphalt and twisting tree branches. Luke checked the clock on the dashboard. Midnight. Still hours to go before he reached the nearest truck stop. The radio crackled with static, breaking the uneasy silence in the cab. Luke adjusted the knob, hoping for a weather update, but all he got was faint, distorted voices whispering just beyond recognition. He turned it off, unease prickling the back of his neck. As he rounded a sharp bend, his headlights caught something in the middle of the road, a figure. Luke slammed the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt. Heart pounding, he leaned forward, squinting through the rain. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was hunched over, wearing a tattered coat that clung to his frame, his back turned to the truck. Luke honked the horn. "Hey, you need help?" The figure didn't move. "Damn it," Luke muttered. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out into the rain, his boots splashing in the growing puddles. "Buddy, you can't just stand in the road like that. You're going to get yourself killed." He got closer, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The man turned slowly. Luke froze. The figure's face was wrong. His features were sunken, his skin gray and mottled like decaying flesh, but it was his eyes that made Luke's stomach churn. Black pits, endless and empty. The man smiled, revealing jagged teeth that looked like broken glass. Luke stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The beam spun wildly, illuminating the trees on either side of the road. That's when he saw them, more figures, dozens of them, stepping out of the shadows. They moved unnaturally, their limbs jerking as if controlled by invisible strings. Their hollow eyes all fixed on him. Luke bolted back to the truck, slipping on the wet pavement, but managing to haul himself into the cab. He locked the doors and floored the gas, the truck roaring as it sped down the road. In the rearview mirror, the figures didn't give chase. They just stood there, watching him disappear into the night. Luke's hands trembled as he gripped the wheel, his mind racing. He had to focus on the road, get as far away from this place as possible. A few miles later, the rain began to let up. Luke allowed himself a shaky breath, glancing at the side mirrors to make sure he was alone. The passenger seat was empty, or so he thought. As his eyes flicked back to the road, something moved in his peripheral vision. Slowly, he turned his head. The man from the road was sitting in the passenger seat, grinning. Water dripped from his tattered coat, pooling on the floor of the cab. Luke screamed, swerving wildly. When he looked back, the seat was empty again. He pulled over, breathing heavily, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I'm losing it," he whispered to himself, gripping the wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. But then he heard it, a soft tapping coming from the window. Luke didn't look. He didn't want to see what was there. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He turned his head, slowly, dread curling in his stomach. There was nothing there. Relieved, he exhaled shakily. But when he turned back to the windshield, his heart stopped. The man's face was pressed against the glass, upside down, as if he were clinging to the roof of the cab. His black eyes bore into Luke's, and his mouth stretched open impossibly wide, revealing an abyss of darkness. The windshield shattered, and everything went black. Luke was found the next morning, his truck parked on the side of the road. The cab was empty, the windshield broken from the inside. Locals whispered about the hollow men, spirits of those who had died on the mountain roads, cursed to wander and claim the living to join their ranks. And if you're driving those roads on a stormy night, they say, don't stop, don't get out. And whatever you do, don't look into their eyes.